Since the sanctions targeting the Russian ruble ramped up, Russia has been struggling to get paid for its exports, which is a big headache for an economy that heavily relies on them. Now, most of Russia's export revenue is coming in Chinese yuan because no one really wants to deal with the Russian ruble anymore. The ruble has become pretty much useless outside of Russia. It's a currency that's losing its grip fast. Over the last 6 months, the US clamped down even harder. In December 2023, they introduced a new policy that threatens any institution caught dealing with Russian entities with secondary sanctions. These secondary sanctions are as tough as the original ones, meaning if you're caught trading with a sanctioned entity, you'll get hit with the same penalties. For China, this is especially tricky, since less than 5% of its total trade is with Russia. Chinese businesses and banks can't afford to risk facing these secondary sanctions because it would jeopardize over 95% of their other business activities. By June 2024, these sanctions intensified. Before that, some smaller Chinese banks were still sneaking around the sanctions by setting up operations near the China-Russia border to handle transactions. But the US and Western countries have tightened the noose, shutting down these loopholes. Now these banks are forced to stop payments and triple-check anyone they deal with in Russia. This has choked the flow of cash in Russia, making it super tough for them to get paid for their exports. Imagine this. Russia signs a big deal to sell lots of oil or natural gas, but then the payments don't come through. At some point, they'll run out of cash to keep things going, and that's exactly what's happening. Russian businesses are struggling to receive payments, and this is also messing up imports because Russia buys most of its stuff from China. If Russian companies can't pay their Chinese suppliers, eventually those imports will grind to a halt too. In its official report for July 2024, the Russian central bank revealed that the revenue Russia earns from its exports is decreasing. Russia is now leaning more on domestic production and demand. This shift highlights the growing importance of Russia's wartime economy. Essentially, the Kremlin is pouring money into thousands of local companies to support the ongoing war in Ukraine, making these companies heavily reliant on government funds. This is turning Russia inward, focusing its economy more internal activities rather than global trading. As a result, Russia is less engaged internationally. The ruble is becoming increasingly irrelevant on the world stage. For both incoming and outgoing payments, Russia is turning to the Chinese yuan. This means the ruble is fading as a global currency. Russia's international trade, both imports and exports, is also decreasing, which is further isolating the country. The impact of sanctions is profound, despite some misleading optimism in the media. You might see headlines claiming that Russia's economy is set to grow faster than the US and the West in 2024, suggesting it's thriving as a high-income economy. But these reports don't tell the full story. Russia's GDP did drop significantly in 2022 and only saw a modest increase in 2023, so any growth now is from a marked lower baseline. Plus, GDP isn't the end-all measure of economic health. To really understand the economic climate, you need to consider the broader picture across the entire economy. Inflation has been climbing for the past 8 or 9 months and has hit double digits. Interest rates are a staggering 16%, which is one of the highest among G20 countries. Only Turkey and Argentina have higher rates, and they're both in the midst of economic crisis. So Russia is definitely in a tough spot. It's becoming more isolated from the global economy and is being forced to rely more on its own internal production and financial resources. But this kind of self-sufficiency has its limits. You can't just keep paying yourself for producing goods, then make those goods and pay yourself again. That cycle doesn't generate new wealth, it just shuffles existing resources around, and eventually these resources will run out. Right now, Russia is trying to fund its economy using its national reserves, but that's a dwindling resource. Over $300 billion of its reserves were frozen by Western countries following the invasion of Ukraine, and that money is now earmarked to be used for bonds to aid Ukraine's defense efforts. So Russia can't touch that $300 billion. The remaining reserves, including gold and other assets, have been decreasing over the last 2 years as the government taps into them to support the war effort. All in all, it's a pretty dire situation for the Russian economy. Since the start of the war, the amount of trade Russia conducts in rubles has significantly dropped. Initially, around 50% of its trade was in rubles because Russia was pushing countries to pay in its national currency. However, over the past 2 years, there's been a huge shift away from the ruble, mainly because Russia's two biggest trading partners, China and India, are opting not to use it. China insists on transacting in the Chinese yuan, which is boosting the yuan's global attractiveness. Other countries are starting to accept yuan payments from Russia for oil and other goods. Meanwhile, India, which initially preferred to trade in Indian rupees, also moved away from the ruble. Russia ended up with more rupees than it could use, since it doesn't buy much from India and found that other countries weren't keen on rupees either. Now, trade between Russia, India, and other nations involves the yuan and United Arab Emirates dirham. This shift is terrible news for the ruble, signaling a decline as a currency. Apart from Russia, the only countries still using the ruble are those like Belarus, Venezuela, and Cuba, which don't have many other options. For most of the world, the ruble is becoming irrelevant, and that's a bad sign for Russia. Typically, the strength of a country's currency reflects the strength of its economy, and in Russia's case, the weakening ruble suggests a weakening